So if you have any questions, thank you very much, Craig, for this presentation. If you have any questions, please use the chat. We're here to answer and to discuss. So
Do
we
you
have,
mind if I just ask the question out loud?
yeah, okay, go ahead.
Would
Yeah.
that be okay? First off, thank you, Mr. Silverman. That was really interesting and helpful. My question was, for the two websites you showed us, the liberal and the conservative one, is that illegal in any form, or are you just allowed to create whatever you'd like to any extent with any information?
So there are rules. I mean, so if we talk about the U.S. context, the United States has libel laws and defamation laws. So if, for example, Kellyanne Conway felt that these articles had really harmed her reputation and harmed her ability to, as a professional or to earn future income by claiming that she had been fired from her job, she could have sued and gone after these guys for that. But there's a pretty high bar. The United States is a country that puts free speech very high up in its priorities, and it is relatively hard to get a verdict around defamation or libel. On the one hand, it should be, and that we shouldn't have tons of frivolous suits. On the other hand, there needs to be repercussions if you are lying about someone and ruining their life and ruining their livelihood. And so, the answer is, like, in that scenario, the person who is in that story has probably the best or only chance. And even in that case, unless that story caused, significant harm to her, it might be difficult for her to win. And so, this is where we have this tension that exists in this field between the importance of free speech and defending free speech, but also in trying to get rid of the incentives that cause people to spread false and misleading information, and trying to hold the platforms accountable for making sure that they aren't radicalizing people, they aren't spreading lies on a massive basis. And this is a difficult and tricky issue to negotiate. But the simple answer is that, I mean, for the most part, like, most of the time you're not breaking a law by lying about something. And in a lot of cases, it would probably be a bad thing if it was against the law for someone to lie about something, right? And this is at the core of the tension of this work, and it also goes, the last thing I'll say is, it goes to also, the accountability that people put on places like Facebook and Twitter. They have the ability to kind of be transmitters of this information and not be liable for stuff, as long as they have appropriate measures in place to remove stuff that violates laws, to remove stuff that violates the policies they set. And so we don't necessarily want these platforms to exercise massive censorship, right? At the same time, we want them to be accountable and to not be platforms that are just full of false and misleading information. And this is the big challenge that is facing them, and that is, I think, facing us as a global community, of how do we navigate these things without squelching free speech, but also with having accountability and creating a good and productive information ecosystem.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So we have two questions, actually, one from Emma and one from Alice, which are a little bit similar. So let me ask them. How would you describe BuzzFeed's strength and weaknesses as a news source? And Alice is asking, do you think social media sites like Facebook are doing enough to prevent fake news? So they are a little bit connected.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the BuzzFeed one. I mean, it's an interesting place to be as a journalist, because, as maybe a lot of BuzzFeed didn't start as a news organization. BuzzFeed started as a place that was just all about, finding and aggregating viral stuff on the internet. They were kind of a lab. They wanted to know why things spread. And in those early days, which, was a fairly long time ago, they weren't really looking to see, well, is this true or is this not true? They were figuring out, why does it spread? And so there wasn't really a journalistic, process in place there. And there wasn't until, I think it was about 2012, when they hired a new editor-in-chief who came from a news background. And so it's been now almost a decade where there have been reporters and a newsroom. And we have evolved to the point now where BuzzFeed News is a separate organization from BuzzFeed, the sort of original one that does lists and quizzes and non-news content. And so on the one hand, as a journalist, I feel really lucky that I get to produce stuff that goes and is published and has some association with the brand that there are a lot of people that really love and are eager to get all kinds of different information from, whether it's shopping information and lists, but also journalism. and I think this is sort of goes to your question a little bit. At the same time, there's a lot of people who do not associate BuzzFeed with news or with certainly like quality information and investigative reporting. And so that's something that over the last almost decade, all of us in the newsroom, we've been trying to build that reputation. We've been trying to build that trust, hopefully by doing good work and showing people, where we're getting our reporting from, and hopefully doing stuff that has good impact. And so, I think there's stuff that really benefits us by being associated with BuzzFeed, but there are also, being such a new news organization and part of a brand that is not known for news, there can be some downsides to that. And that being said, I totally appreciate my colleagues who do the lists and quizzes. I'm not a snob about that. People love that stuff. It's good. And it also, I have a job because of that stuff, because it brings in a lot more revenue than news. So, that's sort of my perspective on, BuzzFeed as a news brand, some advantages and some challenges for sure. And then in terms of, Facebook and social media sites, are they doing enough to prevent fake news? Let's go back to, 2014, 2015, even into most of 2016. They were doing almost nothing. That's the truth. And at this point, they would, kind of acknowledge that, right? Unless somebody was making up lies about, an individual person and spreading it to harass them or that kind of thing, they typically weren't really concerned about their content. And of course, things changed in 2016. And it's not just because of the US election, but also in the Philippines, Duterte was elected early in 2016, and he ran a campaign that relied on a lot of exploitation of Facebook to spread false and misleading information about his opponents. There was also the Brexit vote in the UK, where there was, again, a lot of false and misleading information. And so since the end of 2016, they've gone from doing almost nothing to, I'll give them credit, they're doing a lot more. They're spending a lot more money on it. They've hired a lot of people to work on it. And remember when I mentioned there's more than 300 fact-checking organizations around the world? A big reason why there are so many of those today is that Facebook now is paying organizations to help fact-check information on Facebook. So they are actually putting money into fact-checking. They are funding journalism. They're helping train journalists in these areas. But have they done enough? And have they really gotten their arms around the problem? No. There's still a lot more for them to do. Facebook had its most profitable quarter in its history last quarter. And at the same time, look at the kind of, false information about COVID and false information about the US election and other parts of the world that are still rampant on Facebook. And again, I acknowledge, we have a conundrum here around we have to value free speech and not squelch it. But at the same time, they are so big and there is so much content on these platforms that they simply do not know what's going on them at any given time. And until they're able to really have a full sense of the kind of stuff that exists on their platform, this is always going to be a problem. They are just too big to moderate at this point. And so they have made a lot of advances. They've invested a lot of money. They have people dedicated to it. They are funding people outside to do it, but we still have a really big problem. And it remains to be seen how much more progress they can actually make, because they're putting a lot of their eggs in the automation basket of automatically detecting, and there's still a long way for them to go on that front. So, that's sort of my perspective of, they've come a long way, but I think we still have a lot more work to do.
And I think in what you said, you may have answered an earlier question that we also got. How do you verify the information from overseas, which could be interpreted as how do we, are there fact checkers that exist outside of, the US, like French ones, Italian ones, Brazilian ones, etc.? Or how does the US potentially check the information that comes from overseas, where it may or may be more difficult to check resources or sources?
Yeah, so that number of more than 300 fact-checking organizations, that's a global number. There are a lot in the US, but you know what? There's a lot in India. There's a lot in Europe, mostly in Western Europe, but also some in Eastern Europe as well. So that is a global figure. There's more of them. When you're talking about information coming from overseas, the first piece here is if there's some written element of it, you need to have some expertise in the language. And so for me, if I'm seeing something and I'm interested in it for whatever reason, I might do a quick and dirty translation using, Google Translate or another translation service to try and get my bearings, but I'm not going to write an article based on what I get from an auto translation service. So finding people with, not just linguistic expertise, but also domain expertise to understand slang, to understand context. That's really, really important. You can't take that for granted. And, so that's a piece of it, is like, okay, what is actually being said or claimed here? Hopefully having some people you can work with who understand that context. And then, another piece, frankly, that is used a lot is reverse image search. If this is something that has a photo at the heart of it or some kind of image, even the meme itself, you can reverse image search a meme and see where else it's been online. Has somebody else fact checked it? Has somebody else written about it? And so those are some of the things that I would do right away. And one of the other pieces of it is, if I'm interested in a particular meme or article, I would then try to search across social networks and on the web to figure out where else that is. Is this the only version of this piece of information, or can I find variations making the same claim? Can I find different Facebook pages sharing the same thing? Can I find people tweeting about having seen it in a WhatsApp group, for example, that's crossing platforms like that? So language and domain expertise is really important. Using reverse image search, again, can be really, really helpful. And keep in mind that, again, even if it's a meme that is just all text, you can reverse image search the image of that meme and see where else it is. And Google is actually pretty good at character recognition across languages, so you may actually get results for that.
Here's another question. In my anecdotal experience, people the age of my undergraduate students' parents and up are more gullible than I perceive my undergraduates to be. Do you think there is any evidence for generational credulity?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's important to note here is that this isn't about intelligence, right? And so there is some data about this, and it's the only data I'm aware of is in the US, but I just want to say off the top that this isn't about like who's smart and who's not, right? I talked a lot about how confusing this information environment is, and that is true for everybody. Even if you spend a lot of time online, you can still get fooled. It just has to be the right, perfect thing to appeal to you. So with that being said, the data that has been accumulating in the US does seem to suggest that people over 65 tend to be more inclined to consume and share false and misleading information. And this is studies that have been done over the last 5 years or so. And part of this may be a generational thing in that, they may have worked with technology in their job every day, but perhaps now they've been retired for, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. They're not going to keep up with the latest technology necessarily, right? So again, it's not about, how smart they were or what they did for a job or anything like that. It's about, are you kind of immersed in this environment every day? Or is getting onto your iPad and navigating it and then navigating all of these different unknown news sources a challenge for you? So there does seem to be some evidence indicating that in the US. It's a challenge for above 65. But I do also want to say that, the worst thing people can do is get smug about their own intelligence and get smug about their own ability to navigate information. And so, that's the perfect way for you to get caught out by something, is to think that you'll never get fooled because of who you are and that kind of thing. So, definitely some data that's giving us indications along those lines, but I do think that we are all affected in different ways.
All right, and we have another question from Ace. Do you think Facebook's Supreme Court will take disinformation cases anytime soon? And what do you personally think the court ought to consider in such a case?
So there's a few ongoing cases in the U.S. that are interesting here. So one group of cases is against Alex Jones, the conspiracy theorist who runs InfoWars. If you remember, there was a mass shooting at Sandy Hook at a school, killed a lot of children. And in the immediate aftermath of that, and even for years after, Alex Jones talked about it being, fake, about there being actors pretending to have lost their children. And so the parents of children killed at Sandy Hook have sued Alex Jones on that basis. And so it's not necessarily, a straight up claim of saying, well, we're suing him because he spread disinformation. They're suing him for, I believe it's like emotional distress, but also elements of defamation and other things in there. And so those cases continue to advance. A lot of people thought they might be thrown out because, again, there is that kind of high bar. But they continue to advance, and I believe the Texas Supreme Court even allowed one to move ahead very recently. So that's a set of cases that I think are really interesting to see what happens there, because Alex Jones, part of his defense is that basically he's like playing a character named Alex Jones, and that people who watch his programs know not to trust what he's saying. That's actually a defense that Fox News has made for Tucker Carlson in recent court cases as well, saying that, you know, Tucker does not pretend to be a journalist. People know that he is not presenting credible information, which is a pretty incredible thing for your employer to say about you when, you know, you work for supposedly a news channel. So there's the Alex Jones cases, which are interesting. And I mean, I think to me, when you're talking about a lie like that, and the consistency of it and the harm that that causes, you know, to me, if there's very narrow decisions there that can get those parents some justice and relief, that's good. But I'm very concerned that there's any kind of broad change to laws that makes it super easy to sue anyone in media, right? There's a bit of self-interest there, but also you could imagine how that could lower the quality of discourse and the ability to get controversial information out there. Last quick note is there's a bunch of new cases that have been filed on behalf of 2 voting machine companies against people like Rudy Giuliani and against, in fact, some, you know, so-called news channels like Newsmax and OAM. This is the case where people have been 100% lying about there being voter fraud with these machines, making insane claims like, you know, the leader of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, was secretly behind one of these companies. In almost all the cases, these companies literally had nothing to do with the states where there were claims that their machines were flipping votes, like their machines were not active in these states. So that's a really interesting set of cases because you have very prominent figures like Rudy Giuliani just lying off their ass about stuff, doing it very publicly, doing it on behalf of the president at the time. And so those are going to be interesting cases to watch. Again, like the things that they were doing were like not just sort of like, hey, I said this thing, but it wasn't true and I'm sorry. It's like they kept lying and knowingly lying, and they profited or benefited from it. So you know, my main thing I would just say on that is if there are decisions in the favor of the plaintiffs, I hope they are narrow, and I hope they do not erode, you know, freedom of the press and other protections that are important. But I would also like to see folks get some justice for these completely blatant and malicious lies.
All right.
Excellent. Do we have time for one more question? Maybe?
Yeah. Well,
Okay, I just want to say that there is a link in the chat, and if everybody could fill out, it's really quick, just a survey to say why you came to today and what your interests are in disinformation and fake news. So it shouldn't take long. Just click on the link and fill it out, and then Sherman's going to ask one more question.
Yeah, we have 3 more, but let me ask this one from Natasha. What do you think of the fact that Twitter deleted Trump's account? Is that the end of freedom of speech or not?
I don't think it's the end of freedom of speech, but I think that obviously it's a very big step to remove the account of a world leader. But at the same time, you know, for me, the context is, well, you know, why did they remove it? And to me, it's like they removed it because the information coming from that account over the previous 2 months had clearly played a role in inciting, you know, an attempt to stop the democratic, peaceful transition of power. And if we're thinking about high bars, that's a pretty high bar. Like they let him get away with so much for so long, lying about people, making false claims about the electoral system for a very long time, saying things that would get anyone else banned. They and Facebook and others gave him an extremely long leash. And really, like at the end of the day, you know, if you can sort of look at it and say like, well, what if the moment he started lying about the results of the election after, you know, things were sort of certified by the states, what if they had stopped him then? Would 5 people have died at the Capitol? So my view is that I think it's justifiable what they did, but it also absolutely opens a huge can of worms because, you know, they gave him a very long leash, as I think heads of state should get. But when it comes to inciting violence, that, if we think about the framework of libel and defamation and other laws in the United States, that is really like a hard ceiling that is there. If you are going to cause clear bodily harm or loss of life, then you have stepped outside of the bounds there. So that being said, I mean, these platforms have very inconsistent policies, very inconsistent enforcement. And it's not a simple and easy, straightforward thing, and it's going to be battled out for a long time. But I can see why they, would have decided to do that. And there's probably a decent argument that if they had acted sooner on these particular lies, maybe things wouldn't have turned out the way they did on January 6th.
And we're going to squeeze in one last question by Christian. Are there countries where they have educated their population to be more skeptical about what they see and hear in the media? And is this problem going to get better or worse?
Yeah, so there are some countries that have taken this element of kind of resiliency more important. And a lot of them are ones that used to have to deal with Soviet disinformation and attempts to influence their information space back when the Soviet Union existed. So I believe actually if you Google like Sweden and fake news and CNN had a story recently looking at what Sweden does in its schools. It starts very young with people, and Finland does work. And then if you look at Latvia as well, another country that's doing work in this area. And the thing that's really important about this is that it's not about saying, here's a list of good websites and news sources and here are the bad ones. It's about equipping people to make smart decisions and navigate this universe, about them asking questions, about them pausing, about them considering the information that is in front of them and where it's coming from. And those are skills that we should all have. And I do think if over time countries around the world commit to doing good evidence-based media literacy and doing the things that are actually shown to work, because there's still a lot more data to be collected, I think over time, that's our best hope, is a very resilient population who can do this for themselves without having to rely on platforms or having to rely on technology.
All right, so I think our time is up for this talk. Sorry if we didn't get to answer all your questions, but thank you very much, Craig, for taking the time to speak with us. Thank you very much for everyone for your attendance and for your questions. We're gonna stick around for a few more minutes, maybe. So if you really needed to ask a question, please do so. Otherwise, that's all for today. Thank you very, very much to everyone. We'll share the links to the PowerPoint presentation and via email, and that's all. All right, thank you very much.
Please fill out the survey. Thank you, Mr. Silverman. That was really, really great talk. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
If I may, since my question was not read, first of all, thank you for organizing this event, and thank you for your intervention. But since you mentioned Sweden, and my question was actually thinking about what's happening with Sweden, the equivalent of their CDCs is showing a lot of data or interpretation of statistics that show that actually the response of Sweden, that has been very different from the rest of Europe, was actually effective. And for instance, they had some animation showing that the number of deaths per week in the past 5 years were actually consistent, and 2020 was just mildly less than 2% higher than the previous one. So presenting it as a good thing is not a false information, but they are interpreting and presenting it as a good work of their institution. So the question that I asked was, what is the role played by this public, if we can call it this way, official information in delivering news, even in, as you mentioned, a society that provide instrument for its own citizens to actually being able to read and interpret well, but create at the same time, when in conflict with other interpretation given by the imperial models that was presented in England or their other institution, creating, so what can we follow? What do we have to follow? What we know, what is reliable or not? And therefore, maybe giving room for the development of, and the spreading of misinformation and disinformation on social media.
Yeah, I mean, so your example is specific to Sweden, but I mean, the truth is that, and I work in the media, the truth is that journalists do get it wrong, right? We make mistakes. Most of the time, they're unintentional. There are some malicious actors in journalism who will, deliberately torque things or make things up. It's rare, but it happens. And so, so that is something that is there and is a part of the universe. I mean, the research project I did in 2014 was actually focused on how news websites will often amplify false or misleading information. And so it is absolutely a factor where maybe mostly unintentionally, they will put out bad information. And when it comes from, the sort of the main public broadcaster, as you're describing in Sweden, I mean, obviously they are something that is, particularly in Sweden and other Nordic countries, their public media tends to be very broadly trusted. And so that information coming from the Swedish public broadcaster will be seen as very trustworthy by a lot of people. Now, I don't know whether what they're presenting is accurate or not, but I mean, to that initial question, what is the effect of that? Well, a lot of people are going to believe that. Absolutely. Like that comes with a huge amount of earned credibility over decades and decades and decades that they present this information. Now, hopefully in a healthy media ecosystem, they may present that. And if there is, really valid dissent from it, other media organizations will be willing to stand up and say, no, this is wrong. And that is when there is, a true kind of battle of ideas. But, if it's coming from the Swedish public broadcaster and the only people dissenting are from media that is not seen as credible, then the public may not see it. They may not treat the information as something for them to figure out. And the other thing I would say about it is, you're talking about the difference between the imperial models and what the models that the Swedish public broadcaster is presenting. I personally probably would not be an expert enough to sit there and look at these two things in front of me and know which one I should be trusting. So I think it's a really complicated and tricky scenario. And I would hope that the Swedish broadcaster has been very clear and transparent about the numbers it's using and where they came from and its models. Otherwise, if there's a lot of obfuscation there, that is something that would raise an alarm. So, I mean, the truth is that a lot of people who deliberately create, disinformation, they love to get journalists to take it up because you get that credibility factor on top of it. So if this is a case where the Swedish public broadcaster has taken up, information and not done a good job verifying it, there's a lot of people in Sweden who are going to believe that information, and it's going to be very hard to dislodge it from them. So it's potentially, very harmful if in fact the way they've presented this info is wrong. And as I say, I don't know either way because I don't know the data well enough, but I mean, the impact of that is massive. Absolutely. The Swedish public broadcaster doing it. Yeah.
All right.
Excellent, thanks. Definitely follow Craig on Twitter. Is a great place. You'll find he posts lots of really interesting stuff, and you can ask him questions. So I don't want to hold him up anymore, but thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And we could go on all night, but we eventually have to go. So thanks again.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Laura.